December 19th, 1944. 14:30 hours. Verdun, France. Gray winter light leaked through shattered windows of a converted French army barracks, illuminating ribbons of cigarette smoke that coiled toward water-stained ceilings. The air tasted of stale tobacco, bitter coffee grounds, and something sharper, the metallic tang of fear. Around a scarred wooden table that had once hosted French officers planning the defense of their republic sat the most powerful commanders in the Allied war machine. Major General Omar Bradley, Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, his beret tilted at its trademark angle despite the gravity crushing down on every man present. Map folders lay splayed open like autopsied corpses. Red and blue grease pencils marked positions that were already obsolete. The front had collapsed so fast that intelligence could barely track it. Ashtrays overflowed with crushed Lucky Strikes and British players' Navy Cut. Pencils were clenched in tired, ink-stained fingers. Not a single man in that room was smiling. 3 days earlier, over 200,000 German soldiers had exploded out of the fog-shrouded Ardennes forest and slammed into American lines like a sledgehammer into glass. The blow had materialized from nowhere, a phantom army that Allied intelligence had assured everyone didn't exist. Germany was supposed to be exhausted, beaten, incapable of anything more than delaying actions and local counterattacks. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been so confident that some staff officers were already planning victory parades. Now, American regiments were being overrun, surrounded, erased from existence. Radio operators screamed for help that wasn't coming. Forward observers watched their own positions being overrun and had seconds to transmit final coordinates before German tanks crushed their foxholes into the frozen earth. Reports piled up faster than anyone could process them. Entire battalions gone silent, division headquarters evacuated in panic, supply dumps torched to prevent capture. Somewhere in the snow-covered chaos, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, heroes of Normandy and Market Garden, was surrounded in a Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. If that town fell, if those roads opened, German armor could tear the Allied front in half, drive to the Meuse River, perhaps even reach Antwerp. The entire campaign to liberate Europe could unravel in a matter of days. At the head of the table sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. His face was drawn, the boyish Kansas grin that charmed reporters replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of a man watching his strategy disintegrate in real time. He studied the map spread before him, red arrows representing German spearheads stabbing deep into Allied territory like arterial bleeding, blue defensive positions retreating, fragmenting, dissolving. The room buzzed with low murmurs, urgent whispers, the shuffle of papers. Then Eisenhower raised his head. When he spoke, his voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. How soon? The question hung in the smoke-filled air. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? Silence fell like a theater curtain. Generals who commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands suddenly found their maps intensely fascinating. Bradley stared at logistics charts. Devers traced supply routes with one finger. Minds raced through impossible calculations, distances, fuel consumption rates, ammunition tonnage, road capacity already choked with refugees and retreating units. To disengage entire formations from active combat, turn them 90 degrees in the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades, then hurled them into a new battle against an enemy drunk on sudden victory. It was the kind of scenario that war colleges used to teach students why certain operations were theoretically impossible. No one wanted to answer first. Then Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding general of the Third Army, spoke. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, utterly devoid of drama. He can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours, 3 divisions in 72 hours. Heads snapped toward him as if jerked by invisible wires. Several officers blinked, certain they'd misheard. Others thought he must be grandstanding again, another of Patton's legendary boasts designed to impress Eisenhower and needle Montgomery. 48 hours to disengage multiple divisions from active combat, wheel an entire army 90 degrees, move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles over frozen roads barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, then attack into prepared German defensive positions? It was beyond optimistic. It sounded operationally insane. Every experienced officer in that room understood the scale of what he was promising. Moving a single division required coordinating thousands of vehicles. Artillery batteries had to be withdrawn from firing positions, ammunition stockpiled, fuel distributed, maintenance crews positioned, medical units relocated, communications networks rewired. The choreography involved made a ballet look simple. And Patton was talking about 3 divisions, in 2 days, in winter, through a countryside already gridlocked with military traffic. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, one eyebrow arched in theatrical skepticism. Bradley's expression suggested he was mentally calculating whether his subordinate had finally lost his mind. But Patton's face remained calm, his jaw set, his pale blue eyes unwavering. There was no boast in his voice, no theatrical pause for effect. He wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't guessing. He was the only man in that room who had seen this coming, and he had been quietly preparing for it for 11 days. December 9th, 1944, 8:30 hours, Nancy, France. Third Army Headquarters. 10 days before the meeting in Verdun, Third Army Headquarters occupied a complex of requisitioned French government buildings in Nancy. The offices smelled of floor wax, mimeograph fluid, and the particular mustiness of European bureaucracy. Staff officers hunched over typewriters, clacking out reports. Radio operators monitored frequencies, their headsets crackling with routine traffic. Map rooms displayed Third Army's positions as it pressed toward the Saar region of Germany, a grinding, methodical advance that seemed to promise eventual victory, however costly. On the surface, everything appeared routine, standard operational tempo for an army on the offensive. Colonel Oscar Koch, Third Army's G2 intelligence officer, saw something different. That morning, Koch walked into Patton's office carrying an armload of reports, signal intercepts, and hand-annotated maps. Koch was not a dramatic man. He had the temperament of an accountant, not a warrior, meticulous, analytical, emotionally reserved. He weighed evidence like a jeweler weighed diamonds, with precision instruments and ruthless skepticism. But there was urgency in the way he moved, a tightness around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. He spread his materials across Patton's desk without preamble. "General, we have a problem." Patton looked up from the morning briefing he had been reviewing. His office was Spartan. A desk, a map board, a photograph of his wife Beatrice, nothing decorative or comfortable. He studied Koch for a moment, then gestured for him to continue. For weeks, Koch explained, he had been tracking German unit movements across the entire Western Front, not just the Third Army's sector, the whole theater. And a pattern had emerged that made his stomach clench with professional dread. 15 German divisions had vanished, not destroyed, not scattered, vanished,
withdrawn from the line in careful sequence and replaced by second-rate garrison units. These weren't hollow formations scraped together from convalescents and teenagers. These were full-strength divisions, several of them Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units with hundreds of tanks and assault guns, elite formations that represented the best combat power Germany still possessed. Koch had flagged this through channels. He'd sent reports to Bradley's headquarters, to SHAEF intelligence. The response had been swift and dismissive. Those divisions were being held in operational reserve to counter future Allied breakthroughs, standard defensive doctrine, nothing to worry about. Koch didn't agree. He traced lines on the map with a mechanical pencil, his movements precise and controlled. "Sir, holding 15 divisions in reserve doesn't match Wehrmacht operational patterns. They don't have the fuel or logistics to maintain that kind of strategic reserve without a specific objective. This isn't defensive posture. This is offensive mass." He pointed to the Ardennes sector, an 80-mile stretch of forest, ravines, and narrow roads held by only 4 American divisions. The 4th, 28th, 99th, and 106th Infantry Divisions were stretched across terrain that military doctrine said should require at least 12 divisions to defend properly. The sector was quiet, considered a rest area where green units could acclimate to combat and exhausted units could recover. That was precisely why SHAEF intelligence wasn't worried about it. No rational commander would launch a major offensive through the Ardennes in December. The terrain was atrocious, forests so dense that armor could barely maneuver, roads that became mud traps in rain and ice sheets in snow. The weather was guaranteed to be terrible. Air support would be grounded. Supply lines would be nightmares. Koch reminded Patton of an uncomfortable historical fact. "Sir, in May 1940, the Germans did exactly this. They drove through the Ardennes, smashed the French and British armies at Sedan, and reached the Channel coast in 6 weeks. The terrain that guaranteed safety became the gateway to catastrophe." Patton's expression hadn't changed, but Koch knew his commander was listening with total focus. The evidence didn't end with missing divisions. Radio traffic in the Ardennes sector had spiked over the past 2 weeks, unusual patterns of signals that suggested command posts being established, artillery being registered, engineers conducting reconnaissance. German prisoners of war, when interrogated, mentioned new units arriving behind the lines. Belgian civilians reported increased German activity, convoys moving at night under blackout conditions, more patrols in the forests, the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles that could only be tanks. Individually, each piece of intelligence could be explained away. Collectively, they formed a picture that made Koch's trained instincts scream warnings. He laid out his conclusion with clinical precision. "General, I estimate there's a major German offensive building. Target, the Ardennes. Objective, breakthrough to the Meuse River, possibly Antwerp. Timing, within the next 2 weeks." Then he added something that would prove devastatingly accurate. "If they achieve surprise, they could cut our front in half." The room fell silent except for the distant clatter of typewriters and the low hum of radio equipment. Outside, a truck convoy rumbled past, gears grinding as drivers navigated Nancy's narrow streets. Patton picked up the phone on his desk and dialed through to Bradley's headquarters. When the connection went through, he presented Koch's assessment clearly and without embellishment. 15 Panzer divisions unaccounted for, suspicious activity in the Ardennes sector, a thinly held American front, the pattern of 1940 repeating itself. Bradley listened. He was a careful, methodical commander, the GI's general, respected for his balanced judgment. But on this he disagreed. SHAEF intelligence had already assessed the situation. Germany simply didn't have the fuel, the replacement troops, or the strategic reserves necessary for a major offensive. The war was in its final phase. Hitler's armies were retreating on all fronts. Every intelligence estimate, every logistical analysis, every strategic appreciation pointed to the same conclusion: Germany was finished. Bradley's response was polite but firm. "Don't worry about it, George. SHAEF has got it covered." Patton replaced the receiver slowly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked at Koch. "Oscar, how confident are you?" Koch didn't hesitate. "Very confident, sir." Patton nodded once, a single sharp movement like a judge's gavel. "Then we prepare for it. Start planning." From that moment, while Third Army continued its offensive operations in the Saar, pushing forward, taking objectives, writing the official narrative of continued Allied progress, a shadow operation began behind the scenes. Koch and his staff drew up 3 detailed contingency plans for a rapid 90-degree pivot north in response to a German breakthrough in the Ardennes. They worked at night, in spare hours between regular duties, treating it like a theoretical exercise that no one else believed would ever be needed. The work was exhausting and painstaking. Every road from Third Army's current positions to the Ardennes was studied, not just primary highways, but secondary roads, farm roads, logging trails. Which bridges could handle Sherman tanks? Which intersections would become fatal bottlenecks? Where could supply dumps be pre-positioned? How much fuel would each division need for a 100-mile movement? What about artillery? Enough for transit and immediate combat. They calculated truck capacity down to individual vehicles. Artillery units were assigned specific routes and firing positions they would occupy after deployment. Infantry regiments were given detailed assembly areas, staging points, and march tables measured in hours and minutes. Command posts were designated. Communication protocols were established. 3 plans emerged, each corresponding to a different scenario of how the German offensive might develop. Plan A, if the enemy thrust came from the north. Plan B, if the main axis was further south. Plan C, if circumstances required a different response entirely. Each plan was a masterpiece of staff work, hundreds of pages of movement tables, logistics calculations, and coordinated actions that would have to execute with split-second timing across an entire army. Some of Patton's subordinate commanders thought their boss had finally crossed the line from aggressive to delusional. Why divert precious staff time and energy to planning for a hypothetical emergency 100 miles away while they were actively fighting in another sector? Why prepare to abandon an offensive they were winning? But they obeyed. They were Patton's officers, and Patton had a reputation for being right about things that made other people nervous. On December 12th, 4 days before the German offensive, Patton gathered his corps and division commanders for what appeared to be a routine conference. He told them something that caught everyone off guard. Be ready to disengage from current operations on very short notice. Could be 24 hours, could be less. He didn't explain why. He didn't mention missing panzer divisions or Koch's intelligence estimates. He simply gave the order and watched their faces carefully, gauging who would follow without questions and who would hesitate. Lieutenant General John Milliken, commanding 3rd Corps, frowned. "Sir, are we pulling back? Are we going on the defensive?" "No," Patton said. "We're going to be ready to move. Fast. That's all you need to know right now." By December 15th, Third Army occupied a unique position among all Allied forces in the European theater, while other commands focused solely on their current operations, planning the next phase of advances, counting days till Christmas, rotating exhausted units into rest areas. Third Army alone had detailed, executable plans ready to respond if the Ardennes exploded. Most of Third Army's officers still didn't know why, but they were ready. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours, the Ardennes forest. The stillness shattered. Along an 80-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, German artillery opened fire. Not the sporadic harassment fire that American troops had grown accustomed to, but a hurricane. Thousands of guns firing in coordinated barrages that turned the pre-dawn darkness into flickering orange hell. Private First Class Richard McKee, 106th Infantry Division, was in his foxhole near the Our River when the first shells came screaming in. He'd been writing a letter home to his mother in Pennsylvania, trying to reassure her that his sector was quiet, that everyone expected to be home soon. The pencil flew from his hand when the ground heaved. Trees disintegrated into splinters. The air filled with the shriek of incoming rounds and the wet crump of explosions in frozen earth. Communication lines, carefully strung field telephone cables, were severed in the first minutes. Forward observation posts simply ceased to exist, vaporized by direct hits. Entire sectors of the American front plunged into chaos, cut off from higher command, unable to call for artillery support or reinforcements. Then came the infantry. Thousands of German soldiers in winter camouflage emerged from the fog-shrouded forests like ghosts. Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, Volksgrenadier divisions, Waffen-SS assault units. Behind them, the distinctive roar of Panzer engines, Mark IVs, Panthers, King Tigers. The ground trembled under their weight. 3 German armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the center, 7th Army in the south, more than 200,000 men, 1,400 armored vehicles, were slamming into 4 overstretched American divisions that expected a quiet sector. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, initial reports were confused and contradictory. Local counterattack, some officers suggested, a spoiling operation to disrupt Allied preparations for the next offensive. Give it a few hours, the situation will clarify. But the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, newly arrived in theater and placed in the Ardennes specifically for a gentle introduction to combat, was being systematically destroyed. 2 of its regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, found themselves surrounded in the Schneeifel, a forested ridge that became a trap. They fought with desperate courage, but they were cut off, outnumbered, running out of ammunition. On December 19th, after 3 days of hell, approximately 7,000 men from those 2 regiments would surrender, the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in the European theater. Further north, the 99th Infantry Division bent but didn't break, fighting a savage delaying action that disrupted German timetables. Near Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery and infantry turned the snowy ground into a killing field, stopping the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance cold. But in the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hacho von Montefiore, was achieving breakthrough. His forces punched through American defenses and began racing west toward the Meuse River. Villages fell. Road junctions were seized. American units that tried to form defensive lines found themselves outflanked and surrounded. The Bulge, the name that would define the battle, was forming, a massive westward penetration into Allied lines that on maps looked like a grotesque tumor. And at the tip of the German spear, the road network converged on a single Belgian market town, Bastogne. December 16th, 1944, 13:20 hours. 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy. The duty officer burst into Patton's office without knocking. "Sir, we're getting reports of a major German attack in the Ardennes, multiple sectors, heavy casualties." Patton was at his map board, studying 3rd Army's positions in the Saar. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Get me, Colonel Koch." Koch arrived within minutes carrying the latest intelligence summaries. He didn't look surprised. He looked vindicated and terrified, because being right about this meant thousands of American soldiers were dying. "It's them, sir. The missing panzer divisions, all 15 of them, plus supporting infantry. This is the offensive I predicted." Patton studied the preliminary reports, the pattern of attacks, the weight of effort, the objectives. His mind was already racing through the contingency plans, calculating which version to execute. "What's their objective?" he asked, though he already knew. Koch pointed to Bastogne on the map. "Road junction. 7 major highways converge there. If they take it, they can push armor west to the Meuse, possibly all the way to Antwerp, split our front in half." Patton nodded once. He walked to the door of his office and called for his chief of staff. "Get me General Gathy on the phone and prep the staff. We're executing the contingency plans, all 3 versions. I want movement orders ready in 2 hours." His staff stared at him. The Third Army was currently engaged in offensive operations. They had objectives, timetables, logistics chains. You couldn't just stop an army on a dime and point it in a different direction. Except Patton had been planning to do exactly that for 11 days. "Sir," his operations officer ventured, "do we have authorization from Army Group?" "I'll get authorization. You get moving." While other Allied commands were still trying to understand what was happening, arguing over this was a local counterattack or something bigger, scrambling to organize responses, pulling units from rest areas, Third Army was already in motion. Within hours, units in the Saar began receiving movement orders. Artillery batteries ceased fire, limbered their guns, and prepared to displace. Tank battalions pulled back from contact. Infantry companies were told to prepare for rapid redeployment north. The machinery that Koch and his staff had designed in secret, that Patton's commanders had prepared without fully understanding why, began to turn, and it turned smoothly because every piece had been carefully planned. December 19th, 1944, 14:30 hours, Verdun, France. Which brings us back to that smoke-filled room, to Eisenhower's question hanging in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? And Patton's answer, delivered with absolute calm. 2 divisions in 48 hours, 3 divisions in 72 hours. The silence that followed was profound. Eisenhower studied his subordinate carefully. He had known Patton since the 1910s, had served with him in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa, had watched him evolve from a cavalry officer who still believed in sabers to an armored warfare innovator. He knew when Patton was posturing and when he was deadly serious. This time, Patton was serious. "George," Eisenhower said quietly, "this is no time for grandstanding. Bastogne is surrounded. The 101st Airborne is cut off. If we tell those men help is coming and it doesn't arrive—" He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood. If the relief failed, if Bastogne fell, the paratroopers would be overrun. Thousands would die or be captured, the road junction would open, and German armor would pour through. Patton didn't flinch. His pale eyes met Eisenhower's without wavering. "Ike, I have already given the preliminary orders. Third Army is disengaging now as we speak. I have 3 contingency plans prepared and staffed. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days. My intelligence officer predicted it. We're ready."
The room absorbed this in stunned silence. Bradley's face went through several expressions: shock, skepticism, then a dawning realization. "You've been planning for this? For how long?" "Since December 9th, Patton said flatly. "Colonel Koch identified the German buildup. I called you. You said not to worry about it." The reminder hung there, sharp as a blade. Montgomery leaned forward. If you've been planning for 11 days, why didn't you raise the alarm more forcefully? I did, Patton replied. I was told SHEF intelligence had it covered, so I prepared my own army instead of arguing about it. Eisenhower absorbed this without expression. Later, he would order a complete review of the intelligence failure. But right now, recriminations could wait. They had a battle to fight. "All right, George," Eisenhower said, "you're on. Get to Bastogne, and God help us all if you're wrong about this." Patton stood. "I'm not wrong." He left the conference room, found a telephone in an adjoining office, and placed a single call to 3rd Army headquarters. His chief of staff answered. Patton spoke 2 words: "Play ball." Those 2 words triggered everything Koch had planned, everything the staff had prepared, everything the Army had been quietly readying for 11 days. Orders flashed through radio networks, telephone switchboards lit up as calls cascaded down the chain of command. Movement tables that had existed only on paper suddenly became reality. The 4th Armored Division, under Major General Hugh Gaffey, received orders to disengage from combat in the Saar and move north. The 26th Infantry Division followed, then the 80th Infantry Division. Corps headquarters packed up and displaced. Supply dumps were reorganized, ammunition trucks were redirected, fuel tankers changed routes mid-convoy. Over 133,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, tank destroyers, ambulances, kitchen trucks, repair vehicles began turning north on roads already choked with southbound traffic. Retreating American units, wounded soldiers in ambulances, Belgian refugees fleeing the German advance, all of it had to be choreographed, sorted, kept moving. Military police became traffic maestros, standing at critical intersections in sub-freezing temperatures, directing the flow with hand signals and bullhorns. North-south for combat units, south-north for wounded and civilians. Keep it moving. Don't stop. Don't create jams. The weather fought them every mile. Snow fell in heavy, wet curtains, roads iced over, becoming skating rinks for multi-ton vehicles. Tank treads slipped and spun, trucks jackknifed, engines froze despite antifreeze. Mechanics worked through the night with blowtorches and crowbars, getting stalled vehicles moving again. Men who had been fighting in one battle suddenly found themselves racing toward another. Exhausted soldiers who thought they might get a few hours of sleep instead climbed into frigid trucks and sat huddled together, rifles between their knees as convoys rolled north through the darkness. If you made it this far, you're the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments. Drop a like and subscribe so these voices from history, men like those freezing in those trucks, preparing to fight for men they'd never met, in a town most had never heard of, continue to be heard. December 20th to 25th, 1944. The road to Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division led the charge. Combat Commands A and B, Sherman tanks, M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, armored infantry, and half-tracks. They had been fighting in the Saar Valley, grinding through German pillboxes and bunkers. Now they were racing over 100 miles to fight an entirely different battle. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, drove his men like a man possessed. His Shermans rumbled north through villages still decorated for Christmas, wreaths on doors, faded decorations in windows. The column stretched for miles, headlights creating rivers of light through the darkness, exhaust clouds rising like industrial fog. Behind them came the infantry divisions, the 26th and 80th. Men who had been attacking German pillboxes yesterday were now being told they would be attacking German panzers tomorrow. Different objective, different enemy, same brutal mathematics of war. The German forces around Bastogne were formidable. the 2nd Panzer Division, 9th Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, Führer Brigade, elite units commanded by officers who had been fighting since Poland in 1939, who knew their business, who understood that Bastogne was the linchpin of the entire offensive. They dug in along every approach. Villages became fortresses. Ridgelines sprouted anti-tank guns. Roads were mined. Every kilometer toward Bastogne was purchased in blood. On December 22nd, Combat Command B of 4th Armored Division hit German defensive positions near the village of Chaumont. The battle devolved into a mechanized knife fight, tanks engaging at point-blank range, muzzle flashes lighting up the snow, the crack of 75mm guns mixing with the heavier boom of German 88s. Sherman tanks brewed up, ammunition cook-off sending turrets flying 50 feet into the air, turning crews into ashes in seconds. German Panthers were knocked out by coordinated flank attacks, multiple Shermans firing simultaneously to overwhelm their superior armor. Private First Class James Hendricks, a gunner in a Sherman named In the Mood, watched his loader take a piece of shrapnel through the neck from a near miss. Blood sprayed across the breech of the 75mm gun. The loader choked, gurgled, went still. Hendricks and the tank commander dragged the body out through the turret hatch, left it in the snow, buttoned up, and kept fighting. There was no time for grief, no time for anything except loading, aiming, firing. American infantry pushed forward through woods glazed with ice. Every breath created clouds of condensation that marked targets. German machine gunners hidden in frozen foxholes waited until GIs were at point-blank range, then opened fire. The snow turned red. Men screamed. Medics crawled forward under fire, dragging wounded to cover, tourniquets applied with freezing fingers. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters. A copse of trees, a stone farmhouse, a crossroads. Each objective cost lives, time, ammunition. Inside Bastogne, the situation was deteriorating. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units, elements of the 10th Armored Division, artillery battalions, tank destroyer units, about 18,000 men total, had been completely encircled since December 20th. German forces probed their perimeter constantly, testing for weak points, launching coordinated assaults backed by armor. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander while the 101st's regular commander was in the States, moved from position to position, rallying his men. The paratroopers fought with savage determination, turning Bastogne into a fortress of rubble and frozen earth. Supplies were critical. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Medical supplies ran low. Morphine, bandages, plasma, all running out as casualties mounted. Food was rationed to a few hundred calories per day. Men shared K-rations, gave their portions to wounded buddies, survived on melted snow and willpower. Artillery ammunition was so scarce that fire missions were calculated with ruthless precision. No harassing fire, no interdiction missions, only direct support for units under immediate attack. Battery commanders became misers, hoarding shells like gold. On December 22nd, as German forces tightened the noose, 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was formal and chilling. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German officers waited for a response. McAuliffe read the message, thought for exactly 2 seconds, then replied with a single word that would enter military legend: nuts.
The German officers, confused by American slang, asked for clarification. McAuliffe's staff translated more formally. The message means, "Go to hell. The general declines to surrender. You may tell your commander that." The defenders of Bastogne would hold, but they needed relief soon. December 26, 1944, 1650 hours, Eisenhower, Belgium. First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding a Sherman tank named Cobra King, had been fighting for 6 days straight. His crew was exhausted, filthy, running on coffee and adrenaline, but they were close now, so close. The 4th Armored Division had ground through German defenses with methodical savagery. Every village taken, every roadblock destroyed, every counterattack thrown back. The cost had been terrible. Dozens of tanks knocked out, hundreds of men killed or wounded. But they had kept moving. Now, as the winter afternoon faded toward dusk, Cobra King and a small column of tanks and infantry approached the village of Eisenhower, the last barrier before Bastogne. German positions in the village opened fire: anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, machine guns. The lead tank took a hit and lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Bulge didn't hesitate. He ordered his driver to ram through, full throttle. Cobra King's engine roared. The Sherman accelerated, tracks throwing up snow and frozen mud. German soldiers scattered. A Panzerfaust rocket streaked past, missing by inches. Bulge's gunner traversed the turret, fired the 75mm gun point blank into a building where muzzle flashes had appeared. The building exploded. Behind them, infantry poured into the village, clearing houses, neutralizing positions. The battle for Eisenhower was vicious and brief. A confused melee of close-quarters combat, grenades thrown through windows, bayonet work in hallways. Then they were through. Cobra King burst out the far side of Eisenhower and onto the road to Bastogne. Bulge could see American positions ahead, foxholes, sandbagged machine gun nests, the distinctive helmets of paratroopers. He stood in his turret and yelled, "Come here! This is the 4th Armored!" Paratroopers emerged from their positions, faces showing disbelief, then joy, then something deeper. The fierce gratitude of men who had been written off and had refused to die. At 1650 hours on December 26, 1944, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Patton received the message at 3rd Army headquarters. He immediately called Eisenhower. "We're through to Bastogne," he reported, his voice betraying no emotion, as if he'd just announced the successful delivery of a supply convoy rather than the completion of one of the most difficult military maneuvers in American history. The relief corridor was narrow, barely a mile wide in places, exposed to German artillery fire from both flanks. Enemy forces immediately struck at it, trying to sever the connection, but 3rd Army held. More troops poured north. More supplies reached the town. That night, as trucks carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies streamed into Bastogne, the paratroopers who had endured 8 days of hell received what they needed to keep fighting. The Battle of the Bulge would continue into January. The fighting would be some of the most brutal of the entire war. American casualties would reach catastrophic levels. Over 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. The bloodiest single battle the U.S. Army ever fought. But the German offensive had failed. They never reached the maze. Their timetable, already optimistic, had unraveled completely. Fuel shortages crippled Panzer spearheads. Allied air power, once the weather cleared, turned German columns into burning wreckage. The Bulge began to collapse. And the key to that failure, the moment when momentum shifted irreversibly, was Bastogne, the crossroads that held, the town that refused to surrender, the relief that came just in time. Because one general prepared for a battle everyone else said was impossible. After the war, when historians began the painful work of autopsy, they examined the intelligence failure that had allowed over 200,000 German troops to assemble for a major offensive without triggering decisive countermeasures. How had 15 divisions vanished from Allied intelligence assessments? How had hundreds of tanks been moved into position? How had the most significant German offensive since 1940 achieved almost total tactical surprise? The uncomfortable truth was that someone had noticed. Oscar Koch had tracked those divisions. He had mapped their movements. He had analyzed radio traffic patterns, prisoner interrogations, civilian reports, and photo reconnaissance. He had predicted not only that an offensive was coming, but where it would strike and approximately when. His analysis was detailed, methodical, and devastatingly accurate. His reports had been sent up the chain of command. Bradley had been briefed. Schaeff had received the intelligence, and nearly everyone had dismissed it. The reason wasn't stupidity or incompetence. It was something more subtle and more dangerous: assumption. By December 1944, the narrative at the highest levels of Allied command was that the war in Europe was essentially won. Germany was collapsing on all fronts, retreating in the east, defending desperately in Italy, losing ground in the west. Every logistical analysis, every strategic appreciation pointed towards eventual Allied victory. From that perspective, contradictory intelligence got filtered through the lens of expectation. German divisions withdrawing from the line? Obviously being conserved for defensive operations. Increased radio traffic? Routine command communications. Prisoner reports of new units. Propaganda or confusion. The facts were bent to fit the preferred story until the facts finally became too overwhelming to ignore. Which happened at 05:30 hours on December 16th, when reality arrived in the form of 1,000 German guns firing simultaneously. Koch had approached the same evidence differently. He hadn't started with a conclusion and worked backwards. He had asked what the data suggested, regardless of how uncomfortable the answer might be. And when his analysis pointed to danger, he reported it faithfully, knowing it would be unpopular, knowing he might be wrong, knowing that being right would mean thousands would die. He was right. But intelligence, however accurate, is worthless without a commander willing to act on it. Koch's reports reached multiple headquarters. Only one commander took them seriously enough to stake his army's entire operational posture on their accuracy: George S. Patton. He didn't just listen to his intelligence officer and nod appreciatively. He didn't file the reports away for future reference. He bet everything on Koch being right when virtually everyone else in the Allied command structure believed he was wrong. He used precious time, hours and days that could have been spent planning offensive operations. He diverted staff effort to contingency planning when his officers thought they should be focused on current battles. He positioned his army to respond to a crisis that might never materialize. And when the crisis materialized exactly as Koch had predicted, Third Army could do what no other force in the theater could: turn on a dime and counterpunch with overwhelming speed. At Verdun, when Patton calmly stated he could attack in 48 hours, the other generals thought they were witnessing another example of Patton's legendary bravado. The aggressive, swaggering combat commander promising more than he could deliver. They didn't know about the 11 days of invisible preparation. They didn't know about Koch's analysis or contingency plans. They didn't know that Patton wasn't boasting. He was simply describing what he had already put in motion. In the official histories, Third Army's relief of Bastogne is praised as a remarkable feat of arms. The pivot north is analyzed in military colleges as a case study in operational flexibility. But the 11 days of preparation that made it possible are often reduced to a footnote. Oscar Koch's name rarely appears outside specialized intelligence studies. His prediction of the Ardennes offensive, one of the most accurate strategic intelligence assessments of the entire war, was overshadowed by the broader narrative of surprise, crisis, and recovery. Yet for those who study command at the deepest level, the lesson is clear and enduring. Intelligence has value only when leaders are willing to question their own assumptions and act before events force their hand. Preparation is not glamorous. It doesn't come with medals or parades. It's thankless staff work, hypothetical scenarios, plans that might never be executed. But in moments of crisis, preparation is the difference between reaction and execution, between improvisation and precision, between chaos and control. The Battle of the Bulge exposed a catastrophic failure at the highest levels of Allied intelligence and strategic assessment. It revealed how commanders, even brilliant ones, can become prisoners of their own narratives, seeing what they expect to see rather than what the evidence shows. Yet for those who study command at the deepest level, the lesson is clear and enduring. Most commanders in that smoke-filled room at Verdun heard Eisenhower's question and did the same calculation. They looked at distances, timelines, logistics, weather. They concluded that mounting a major counterattack in 48 hours was operationally impossible. They were using the same data as Patton. They reached different conclusions, because Patton had spent 11 days asking a different question. Everyone else asked, "Can this be done?" Patton had asked, "How do we make this possible?" The difference between those two questions is the difference between reaction and anticipation, between being controlled by events and controlling them. On December 26th, when Cobra King broke through to Bastogne, when the relief corridor opened, when supplies began flowing to the surrounded defenders, it looked like a miracle to observers, an impossible feat executed under impossible conditions. It wasn't a miracle. It was foresight. It was an intelligence officer who trusted evidence over narrative. It was a commander who prepared for the worst while everyone else assumed the best. It was staff officers who planned for contingencies they didn't believe would happen. It was soldiers who followed orders they didn't understand. It was the result of 11 invisible days of preparation before the first shot was fired. In war, we celebrate victories with visible symbols: the medal awarded for valor under fire, the flag raised over captured positions, the photograph of soldiers meeting after a successful relief. But the truest victories often happen in silence. In headquarters offices where intelligence officers study reports no one else reads. In planning sessions where staff officers war game scenarios everyone else dismisses. In the minds of commanders who trust their judgment over consensus. The paratroopers at Bastogne fought with extraordinary courage. They held against impossible odds. They said nuts when offered surrender. They deserve every honor history has given them. But they held because someone came for them. And someone came for them because 11 days before the battle began, a general trusted his intelligence officer, questioned the prevailing wisdom, and prepared his army for a fight everyone said was impossible. That is why George S. Patton was the only Allied commander truly ready for the Battle of the Bulge. And that is why the story of Bastogne is not just about desperate last stands and heroic relief forces. It's about the unglamorous work of preparation. The courage to trust analysis over assumption. The willingness to be wrong in planning so you can be right in execution. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the snow-covered crossroads of a small market town, men fought and died. Their sacrifice bought time. Their courage held the line. But time and lines only matter if someone is coming to relieve you. Oscar Koch saw the storm coming when everyone else saw clear skies. George Patton believed him and prepared. And when the hammer fell, Third Army was ready. That readiness saved Bastogne. and saving Bastogne helped save the war. The lesson echoes across decades. The battles you prepare for in secret determine which battles you can win in public. The warnings you heed when they're unpopular save lives when they become undeniable. The plans you make for crises that might not happen are the reason you survive crises that do. Somewhere in that truth lies something bigger than tactics or strategy. It's the difference between commanders who wait for certainty and commanders who prepare for possibility. Between those who react to history and those who shape it. Between those who hope for the best and those who plan for the worst while fighting for the best outcome. On a frozen December morning in 1944, hope was not enough. Preparation was. And that made all the difference.